Japan, in the 19th century. Under the pressure of Western powers, Japan experienced a period of dramatic upheaval. As the tides of global trade and modernization swept through the world, the traditional feudal system faced unprecedented challenges. The Meiji Restoration dismantled the Tokugawa Shogunate's rule, ended centuries of isolationism, and set Japan on a path toward modernization, allowing it to rapidly integrate into global political and economic systems. But what if the Tokugawa Shogunate had managed to maintain its rule? How would the world be different? In the first phase, we will discuss which historical events would cease to exist if the Tokugawa Shogunate had not been overthrown by the Meiji Restoration. First, Japan's opening and treaty signing. In 1853, Commodore Perry led the American black ships to Japan, forcing the Tokugawa Shogunate to end over 2 centuries of national isolation and sign the Treaty of Kanagawa. This treaty symbolized Japan's first opening to the outside world and marked the beginning of its entrance into the modern era. But if the shogunate had insisted on maintaining isolation, Japan would not have signed such treaties and might have faced even more intense Western pressure and military threats. At the same time, internal discontent would have grown rapidly. The samurai class would weaken, and social order would begin to crumble. Without foreign trade, Japan's economy would stagnate, and its international status would gradually decline, becoming marginalized from the wave of globalization. Ultimately, a Japan that once had the chance to become a modern power might have been forgotten in the shadows of history. Second, the First Sino-Japanese War and Japan's rise as an East Asian power. In 1894, the First Sino-Japanese War broke out. Japan and China engaged in a decisive military confrontation, which Japan won, bringing the Korean peninsula into its sphere of influence. With this victory, Japan accelerated its ascent as an East Asian power. But if the Tokugawa Shogunate had remained in power, the war could not have occurred. The shogunate lacked the ability to modernize its military. Still reliant on the traditional samurai forces, it could not compare to other world powers. Unlike the Meiji government, it couldn't carry out large-scale military reforms. This would prevent Japan from expanding abroad, and its international standing would stagnate, failing to join the ranks of global powers. Third, the Russo-Japanese War and Japan's emergence as a global power. In 1904, Japan and Russia clashed in the Russo-Japanese War. Japan ultimately defeated Russia, cementing its dominance in East Asia. This war was not only a showcase of Japan's military might, but also its first global demonstration of military and economic strength. If the Tokugawa Shogunate had still ruled, this war would never have taken place. Its military, based on the samurai system, could not meet the demands of modern warfare. The shogunate lacked the capacity for military modernization and could not transform Japan into a modern nation capable of rivaling other great powers. Fourth, Japan's colonial expansion. During the Meiji era, Japan actively pursued colonial expansion, especially in Korea and Taiwan. In 1897, it began direct rule over Taiwan. If the Tokugawa Shogunate had remained in power, these colonial ventures would have been impossible, or at least significantly delayed. The shogunate, committed to feudal traditions, lacked the drive for external expansion in diplomacy or military affairs. It could not implement the kind of modern foreign and military policies the Meiji government did. This would affect Japan's relations with other East Asian countries like China and Korea, and delay its emergence as a major power, perhaps forever preventing it from playing a leading role in the region. Fifth, global trade and technological innovation. With the Meiji era's sweeping modernization reforms, Japan began importing Western technology and undergoing industrialization, quickly advancing in global trade. In 1871, Japan signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce with the United States, further opening itself to international markets. If the Tokugawa Shogunate had not been overthrown, none of this would have happened. The shogunate was unable to implement the necessary reforms and could not import modern industrial technology. Japan would have continued to rely on its feudal economic structure, missing the opportunity to become a global economic power. Exchange with the West would have been drastically reduced, and Japan would not have participated in global technological innovation and trade expansion, leaving it unable to compete economically with the great powers of the time. In the second stage, we will explore how history might have unfolded if the Tokugawa Shogunate had remained in power. First, increased risk of regional fragmentation and internal conflict. If the Tokugawa Shogunate had maintained the feudal system, regional lords, such as those of Satsuma and Choshu, would likely have retained significant autonomy. This would have increased the risk of regional fragmentation. As economic development created imbalances between regions, local lords might have strengthened their power and challenged the authority of the central government. This could lead to internal conflict, possibly even a return to a warring states-like era, plunging Japan into prolonged turmoil and division. Second, the possibility of a new wave of internal reform movements. Even if the Tokugawa Shogunate was not overthrown, growing external pressure could have sparked internal reform movements. Japan might have experienced internal reform movements. Reformist forces similar to those of the Meiji Restoration might have emerged, seeking political and economic modernization. Though this process would have been slower and more turbulent, various social classes may have pushed for change at different times, through uprisings by peasants, discontented samurai, or reform demands from the commercial class. These reforms might not have stemmed solely from imperialist pressure, but rather from internal social movements demanding transformation. Third, Japan's diplomacy would face greater challenges from Russia and the West. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Russia expanded into East Asia, if Japan had not modernized, Russia might have increased pressure on Japan, especially in geopolitical hotspots like Manchuria and Korea. As Western powers continued their expansion, Japan's isolationist policy would no longer be sustainable, and foreign military threats would become more likely. This could force Japan to either reform internally or change its foreign policy, perhaps leading to diplomatic clashes with Western powers or Russia. Japan would need to assert itself amid prolonged external challenges. Fourth, Asia's military and economic center could shift to China or other regional powers. If Japan had failed to modernize, China and other emerging regional powers in Southeast Asia might have had the opportunity to dominate Asia's military and economic landscape. China's Qing dynasty or other emerging national powers would have had more time to expand their influence. Japan, on the other hand, would have lost the opportunity to rise as a major power in Asia. As Russia moved east and Western powers expanded south, the balance of power in East Asia could have shifted dramatically, resulting in a world where Japan was not the dominant force in the region. The world's landscape would have been drastically different from what we see today. History is a one-way river, but we can always think against the current. If that feudal regime standing tall in the east had never fallen, the civilization we know might never have come to be, and we ourselves might live in an entirely different world. One decisive military reform, one bold break from isolation, can be enough to change the entire world.